there's some things you can accelerate, but there's some things you should absolutely not bypass for the sake of saving time later. Wouldn't you want to do that, get it right the first time instead of having to go back and revamp your product?
The following is a conversation with Vyjayanthi Vadrevu, the founding ethnographer and strategist of Rasa.nyc, where she leads anthropological research. She was also an adjunct professor at City University of New York, where she taught courses in applied anthropology and autoethnography. She has led UX research positions at Capital One's Innovation Lab, Rackspace, and more. Hey Vajanti, how are you? Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We met at the AI conference in San Francisco,
Right.
and I think we almost formed a gang. I think quite
It was great. Yeah.
few people there. We hung out. I think five of us, maybe.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was a fun conference, and then you happened to be in Austin, and I happened to be in Austin again. So we met. We met a few times now. But do you wanna give a little bit of background on what do you do?
Oh, absolutely. I am an applied anthropologist, so I apply the study of what it means to be human and observing and analyzing human cultures to product development. And the most use cases in the startup world have been product development, product iteration, a little bit of process improvement as well.
Mhm.
And all of that comes from really understanding the end user, the consumer, and the startup founders and their culture itself and aligning all of that to create the best possible product,
Mhm.
the best possible fit for the consumer issue, and the most natural for the startup's culture as well.
I was intrigued by what you're doing, and my background is computer science, so uh, very different from my world. And when I was thinking about lining up guests, I thought of having you because a lot of people struggle, a lot of startups struggle with both finding product market fit and executing customer interviews. Do you want to talk a little bit about why it's important to integrate research early in the product development lifecycle, and how should that research be?
Absolutely, it's incredibly important. I think a lot of people have seen the stats on why startups fail. They fail because they couldn't figure out the product market fit. They didn't understand what people actually needed. There was not a clearly defined need when they went and launched their company.
Mhm.
So it's incredibly important to identify that and not only identify, okay, this person is having this issue, but what are the nuances of the issue? And you might think, oh, it's boring, these details, why do we need them? But the details will give you the exact blueprint to what the solution should be and what the features need to be. It's a because then it becomes a no-brainer, but you have to put in that time to really investigate the consumer and how your product or your service will weave into their life by understanding those details.
Mhm. You work with a few founders and startups now. What are some of the common mistakes that early stage startups make with customer interviews?
With customer interviews specifically, I completely understand this instinct, by the way.
Mhm.
The founder or the founding team, they want to both get feedback, but also sell and convince the consumer about the product. Or if they're already a user, they want to kind of like, they were like, well, but this is why this happens, and they're making excuses. So, in any case, it becomes a situation where instead of just finding out the natural reactions to their product or service, they're inserting their opinion, they're inserting their agenda into it. So then they've already tainted the data. So it's amusing, but you also you want the real natural reactions. And even with a little bit of training, there's just that impulse because it's so close to you, which is why so often you don't have the founder doing all of their own research. I think it's incredibly important for them to do the research, but they should also have those fresh eyes and an external view into how people are reacting to their product.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all, I mean, the need to sell is definitely there, because from at least my experience, they want the idea to be a reality, right? They're basically seeking validation.
And maybe that right there is the problem.
Hmm.
They shouldn't be seeking validation. They should be seeking the truth.
Ah, that's a good one.
So so if you're seeking validation, again, you're inserting your assumptions, your biases, and your agenda. And we'll talk about my approach, not only with workshops, but generally in any research project I embark on.
Hmm.
We do kind of an airing of assumptions and an airing of biases. And along with that is testing out what the hypothesis is, what our agenda is, and kind of once they're out in the open, you're like, okay, watch out for your bias here, watch out for your agenda of selling.
Hmm.
So these are things that we do at the beginning of every research study, just so you're not entering that trap of validating
Hmm.
and selling before getting to the truth of what's actually happening when you're not present.
How should an early stage team design their interviews so that they're effective?
So I'll outline the broad strokes
Hmm.
of what comes before even doing the interviews.
Yeah, sure.
And just so again, the whole goal is to get to the truth of how people are actually living and interacting. So first you have the team airing out their assumptions
Hmm.
so that they can go into the research more clear and aware of where their bias might taint the data. And then the second, if possible, you would do a natural observation. You would hang out where your consumers hang out. You would understand their lives holistically, even if you're like, hey, but I'm just trying to do like a fitness product and I want to know how they interact with the app. Well, fitness is also like that's actually a really easy example for me because it's so holistic. And if you want to do a fitness app, shouldn't you be at the gyms or the yoga studios or the outdoor running clubs that these people are going through? And maybe you observe their eating habits, etc. So, observing all of that will actually help you formulate the best questions because the interview, if you look at the interview as a chance to go deep on things that you couldn't quite understand from observing their behavior, you see the interview as a chance to clarify versus like that's where you're going to get all your info and that's not going to give you the best data again because you're not coming in informed.
Hmm.
Your questions will be a little bit more shallow, they'll be a little bit naive. So, why not go in with a more informed approach? And once you create the questions, you have to look at your interview questions and see again, now that you see why the steps are important, right? So because you're aware, much more aware of your biases and your agenda, then you can say, oh, that question, I was kind of leading them into a certain answer. And you definitely don't want yes or no questions in this type of in-depth interview because you again want them to have the freedom to go and answer the question in ways that you couldn't even think. So allow a lot of room for the user, customer, whoever to explore the answer
Hmm.
and go into spaces that you wouldn't anticipate. And that's sometimes where you find the most useful information, the biggest gems that you wouldn't have found out otherwise.
Hmm. Observation does give you an unbiased view of the struggles of the user or the customer, but a, l- a l- a lot of times founders struggle with time, right? How do you find time to, like, what's the level of time needed first of all for these kind of studies, and are there any hacks to do it faster?
That's what everyone asks, but if you don't take some of the necessary time, and I'll get into like some hacks possibly, but if you don't take the necessary time in the beginning, you will fail. So that's where I'm like, I don't know what to say in terms of like skipping this process so that you could fail later. Yes, you get to your product faster, you get to the launch faster, but
Yeah.
do you want to launch something that has a 40% chance of failing,
Yeah.
or do you want to reduce that risk?
Hmm.
There's no replacement for just the time it takes to get things right.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that, you're spending months and months on research. That would actually be
Yeah.
great, to be honest, but you could probably do it in 2 to 3 weeks, but really be honest with yourself about needing to pivot and needing to really address a need that's actually there versus something that you think is cool or something that you want to do better than someone else, but it's only like an incremental improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And some hacks around it. I'm actually advising a company called Ferret,
Mm-hmm.
and they're an ethical AI research platform that does customized research, but it uses AI to accelerate that process.
Hmm.
It was founded by two anthropologists, and so they're very academically rigorous and very committed to the ethics of giving credit back to the experts whose research they're taking from. So they are not the platform does not take from anyone who they didn't get permission from.
So they're not open
Only
AI.
publicly available. They're not. Say it again.
They're not open AI.
They're not OpenAI.
That's right.
They're the yes, they're the darling in the sea of stealing shamelessly. So I feel like platforms like that acknowledge, yes, time is of the essence. AI is becoming a reality. Researchers themselves are using it, and of course, companies that need research are using AI. So why not give people a way to do it ethically and thoroughly and have that academic, not only academic rigor. Again, we talk about truth. Don't you want the most truthful, um, well examined data
Yeah.
and reports and summaries? So that's what that company is doing. So you can use Ferret, you can use, ethical AI to accelerate that process, but I wouldn't skip over the observation. I wouldn't skip over going deep and observing customers how they are. Another hack would be looking at prior work. So Ferret does that. You can also look and do a digital ethnography, look at online spaces where your users hang out, and you'll get again that natural candid conversation, and you'll get those reactions, and you could I would advise you hang out and observe, and then you could also participate, but don't say, hey, I'm starting this thing, give me some feedback, like don't disclose your identity. You could be a little bit covert, like a little bit of a spy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way. So digital ethnography or netnography, like some people have coined it.
Oh,
And
that's cute.
and, um, and I mean that's more than ever. That's easier than it ever has been because so many people hang out in online spaces.
Yeah.
And then another not hack is doing a survey. Surveys will come at the end of this order of operations. If you ask how many before knowing why people do things, so surveys answer the question how many, how wide is this problem,
Hmm.
how deep is this problem, but it doesn't tell you why this problem is happening. It doesn't tell you what else is like an issue
Yeah.
here. And let me bring in a use case right now. It's not necessarily, well, it actually does deal with a product, but I worked with an agency. I was the research function of an agency that had been asked by Mercedes-Benz to understand why their loan processors were dropping like flies. They would quit so quickly. And they were like, oh, I think it's a training issue. So the loan processors would use this certain type of software. And um, so and the software was new, so they thought it couldn't be that. That wasn't the issue. And when I say they, it's the senior leadership.
Hmm.
So the senior leadership wanted us to investigate because they couldn't find the answers through surveys. They were like, employee engagement surveys. No one's really telling the truth of why they're leaving, and then they still leave, even though they said, "I love working here. Everything's great." When we investigated the issue, it was indeed the software that they were so proud of. It was the program would glitch, and you can't make errors on obviously a loan for cars. You just can't do that. So these entry level workers who had barely a high school degree were asked to do calculus in some respects. After 3 days of training on the math,
Hmm.
they were just launched into troubleshooting with very sophisticated mathematical problems. So I bring that up because if we just went with what the hypothesis was
Mm-hmm.
that the senior leadership thought, we wouldn't have found the answer. We wouldn't have thoroughly investigated the issue. And if we just went with surveys, you absolutely would not get the answer there.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some things you can accelerate, but there's some things you should absolutely not bypass for the sake of saving time later. Wouldn't you want to do that, get it right the first time instead of having to go back and revamp your product? And oh my gosh, we have to do basically like a gut renovation of everything.
Yeah.
The features, the way it's all like it's all disorganized. Anthropology can help you not only with what features to have, but how to organize it that matches the mental model of the users so that they're like they're looking at the product and they're not just saying you're solving my problem, but oh my god, you think like me. How did you do that?
Mm,
I mean, wouldn't that be an amazing reaction to have?
yeah.
So invest that time early on so that you can get those kind of reactions and you get people really hooked on your app because they feel like, oh, you're one of us.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, as opposed to what, spending months or maybe even years on a wrong problem and then pivoting again and then pivoting again. Uh,
Yeah. Why so many pivots when you can just
yeah,
go right
slow it
way.
down a
The
bit.
other thing, anthropological approach, like you are looking everything with fresh eyes. You're looking at it through a cultural lens, and you're acknowledging that culture changes and people change. So you have this very flexible view, like this data that actually can grow and acknowledges cultural evolution. So it's like, yes, you invested all this time, but now you have this information that in many cases predict the future. There was an article that the Ferret founders had written about predictive anthropology and how VCs, Reid Hoffman, et cetera, call what the work that they do predictive anthropology
Hmm.
because they're trying to forecast trends by knowing how people are living and thinking and
Hmm.
their habits and their values. And you look at a lot of product market fit stuff, they talk so much about values. Where do those values come from? It's your cultural conditioning.
Yeah.
So once you nail that, you're in a good spot.
One of the things that I see a lot of founders, and I've been party to this crime as well, is you talk to a bunch of potential customers or your ICP, and collecting quantitative versus relying on qualitative data, there's a very slippery slope. And I think founders, again, for that wishful thinking of, or in that search of validation and moving faster, slip towards relying more on qualitative data because we trust our gut more. That's what makes us entrepreneurs. And so, how, in your view, how would you balance between qualitative and quantitative analysis at early stage?
Qualitative is wonderful. All of the data from the human sciences, they're going to be qualitative
Hmm.
in nature. It tells you why certain trends are happening.
Hmm.
I really do think it's important, again, to find out what people are thinking, what people's habits are before finding out how wide is this problem and how frequent is it? Because how can you ask how wide is this problem if you don't even know what this problem is? How can you ask how many people have this habit if you don't even know what that habit is because you didn't do the qualitative work? And I think in terms of the founders, founding team, going with their gut, going with something they personally have observed,
Hmm.
you're part of the data. Just see yourself as one of many.
Hmm.
You don't need to remove yourself completely, but just know that you're one of many perspectives. And so include yourself in that proportion. So if you interviewed 10 people,
Hmm.
just take it externally. You interviewed 10 people, you wouldn't say, oh, that one person was the most important opinion of all the 10
Hmm.
users, right? So that's kind of how founders are seeing themselves. Oh, I interviewed 10 people, but I, being the 11th person, have this really magical opinion. So balance it out
Yeah.
and see yourself as one out of 11
Yeah.
in those situations.
Yeah, tough to do sometimes, but yeah, I get the point. It's just one data point. At the same time, reliance on gut and can be avoided, but at the same time, that's where we kind of lose the balance. Rely too much on our gut as founders rather than relying on the research. And sometimes the research doesn't happen at all.
You were right in calling it a balance because if you over rely on research and you don't have your own perspective as a founder, how can you run the company if you're just um, like, of course, listen, I'm not saying by any means don't like really heavily lean into the research, but in terms of acting on it and making decisions, what do you do after that?
Mm.
Once you have the actionable insights, then you do need to have that clear vision and that confidence in yourself. So,
Right.
I mean, so this is like to overanalyze and overthink and over rely on hundreds of different opinions. That's also not the path.
And so within an organization, what does it look like? What does an anthropologist do?
It really depends on how long the engagement is, but I could work in for sure I'd work on the product innovation, product development, iteration in terms of talking about again those assumptions, seeing the research through, so designing the research, seeing how many people want to participate, like the founders, any team members, who wants to be part of the interviews, who wants to actually conduct interviews once they're trained properly, and then we might do other research methods. By all means, like, we shouldn't use just interviews, just surveys, and just observation. There's focus groups can be used artfully.
Hmm.
So if you're looking for something where you need it's more, I've used it more when I want to see how people influence each other on decisions, on perhaps buying decisions, trend decisions. If you want to see, that's when focus groups I think are really useful.
Hmm.
And don't treat it like a survey, like, oh, how many people in the group said they liked this candy being pink versus blue. I don't think that you shouldn't take it so literally, because if one person who has a maybe more persuasive, stronger energy says, oh, I love the blue and let me tell you why,
Yeah.
and they just convince the whole room why they love blue, but then afterwards you don't know what people will do
Right.
in that room in that moment. You observe that these persuasive people could sway, so just observe the dynamics, and that's what something like focus groups are good for. The other thing, longitudinal studies, how people react to something, a certain habit, behavior, perception over time is very useful, because again, in those interviews, you can go deep, but it's only one instance. You're only seeing one instance. So if you can observe people over time, and a hack for getting this, reducing time on that at least, is you do a diary study where people are really like literally doing a recorded diary of some experience they have every day and sending it to you. So you don't have to sit there, you don't have to record, you don't have to collect the data. It'll come to you, and and then of course you have to analyze it, but you've gotten qualitative data over time. So yeah, I would oversee what, which tools we need to use, which research methods we need to use to get the most truthful answer, the most holistic answer, and really examine the problem, so we know, now we know what the problem actually is. Now we know what the habits actually are. And then I would go through and organize the information, analyze it, and then synthesize it so that we really extract, like, okay, that's great, but what does it mean for us? Like, how do we move forward from this? So, extracting from that data, you will not only get product features and direction for product strategy, but you'll get marketing strategy. You'll sometimes even understand how team dynamics should work and how people should spread out the work and really align on certain values. If this is the thing you want to solve for people, then how should the team's mission orient around that? So you'll get kind of an internal strategy, internal mission alignment, external market alignment, and branding. You would get obviously the product direction, and then maybe even a roadmap. I mean, that's also come out as a byproduct of all of this. So what are the priorities right now where you could really make the customer feel like, you understand me, you solve the problem immediately, you've got me hooked. Okay, what is that central feature that we need to nail so that we get everyone to trust us? And then down the line, we could add in these other really nice to haves, but not must haves.
Hmm.
Yeah.
In a leaner way, if a founder has to, let's say, embed themselves in their ICP's environment, what are some of the things they can do? So one of the things that you suggested was, getting them to record stuff like a diary submission. And people usually have a hard time recording stuff, even for health purposes. I've built personally health tracking apps where the only people who were actually tracking were people with chronic conditions. And so
Mm.
for your target customer, it might not be as relevant for them to do a diary. What are some of the other ways a founder can embed themselves?
I think observation, there's no substitute for how powerful that is. So embedding yourself in the natural settings. Even okay, let's say super time like strapped for time, just do a few hours every day for a week,
Hmm.
like 1 hour here, 2 hours there, and really look at how this is part of your product marketing, branding strategy. So wouldn't you invest that time, like, spinning around a deck anyways? I mean, just think of that, what's the trade-off? You're getting 3 different types of strategic insights,
Hmm.
excuse me, and I think if you look at it like that, you embed yourself, you observe, you kind of put your assumptions to the side. And then with the diary study, perhaps I didn't explain it too well. You would, in all of this, you would have some incentive for your customers. Don't be so entitled thinking that your customers owe you this data. They should be so happy to be interviewed. They should be so happy to submit data
Yeah.
in a diary longitudinal form. So you would say, okay, for 5 days of you sending an email about how you feel when you wake up in the morning and when you go to bed at night and what you did exercise wise, we will give you X amount,
Hmm.
money, gift card, free subscription, whatever you think. And also the incentive, you should know your customers enough to incentivize them in a way that really resonates with them.
Hmm.
So do keep that in mind, and then you will get the data. If you incentivize them properly, you will get that 5-day diary study and organize it in a way that's like foolproof. Like the user can just plug and play and insert their data or do a recording, a voice note or something, whatever it is.
Hmm.
Make it easy for them, but make it meaningful for the context. And um, yeah, I think in those ways they founders can absolutely get started on all of this. I think if you want to hire a social scientist, an anthropologist to kind of orient you, I think that would be really great. I mean, just like you would hire an executive coach, hey, get me ready for this meeting, get me ready for this. Is like my pitch good? Am I sounding confident in the same way? Am I approaching the research correctly? Am I asking the right questions? You can do kind of a consult in that way to just ramp you up if you're really strapped on resources,
Mhm.
both time and funds.
Any examples on what might work as incentives for, let's say, a SaaS product?
Cash is king. So I will just say that you give money and let people do whatever they want. It's not a gift card to this place or that place. But in addition to that, I think people really appreciate it if it's a combination of cash or a gift card from some big retailer, a retailer we all know,
Hmm.
and that goes a long way, I think, but also if they get a little bit of a thank you in the mail that's perhaps not, maybe it's not so expensive on your end,
Hmm.
but it means something to them. So, for example, there was, like, we did this ecotourism project, like, a long, long time ago, and we sent people little tiny plants
Hmm.
that were inexpensive. We did an upfront incentive with the gift card, with the cash, basically, a Visa gift card, and then we sent them these little plants as a thank you. That really helped, and we did need to do a second round, so that's another thing. You might need to go back to them and say, "Hey, we improved on this. Do you mind, working with us again?"
Hmm.
And because you appreciated their time and their input so much in the beginning, you have built that loyal feedback loop. If you show them that you're really grateful for their time and their input, then that'll go a long way.
Hmm. Yeah. These are some of the customers who are going to define the early roadmap and potentially the strategy. It might be worth building a relationship for sure so that you can continue iterating on that journey with them. Makes sense. Between the time we last met and now, you've also given a few talks on ethics in AI. Privacy is a big concern. Slack did a auto opt-in for using user messages a few months back. I don't know what their current policy is, but uh, Reddit is was in negotiation at some point on selling their data for to another big AI model for training their data set. all this user data, the way the companies are going about it doesn't seem ethical at all. How do you think the AI companies can do better?
Well, keeping ethics in the loop is it should be a necessity, not an afterthought. And similar to, thinking like an anthropologist from the beginning of developing your product, part of being a good anthropologist is also being ethical and understanding the values, taboos, and essentially boundaries of the people you're serving. So in the same
Mm.
way, if companies had done that from the beginning and looped the agencies, like the like empowered their users to be part of the process, I think that would
Mhm.
have been a smart move. So uh, there's some companies have already been hiring ethicists, AI ethicists. Chief bias officer was a term that came out of South by Tech for Good roundtable. And having somebody constantly keeping an eye towards that is really important right now, unless you've already bypassed that by designing your actual business strategy around ethics, which is, uh, again, I mean, sure, I'm biased. I'm advising Ferret, but they thought about
Yeah.
that from the beginning because they saw how research was evolving and they saw how these lawsuits were piling up. And they said, why don't we just give credit where credit is due? Why don't we just give back to the people whose data we're taking so the experts are actually going to get paid for the data that Ferret is using? And if you do that
Mm.
from the beginning, or if you would take pains to at least correct your mistakes, I think everyone wins. Why not incentivize your
Yeah.
customers instead of facing a lawsuit down the line? Why not give credit for using somebody's voice, a celebrity's voice, instead of getting sued down the line? I mean, think about these things, like, so companies, I mean, I'm hesitating or struggling a little bit here because I feel like everything I'm saying is common sense in terms of like what would you do as a decent person? What would you do as somebody that's not taking advantage of something? And so it almost seems a little bit silly for me to even be saying these things, but I guess they need to be said.
Oh, well, yeah, they definitely need to be said. If everybody did the decent thing, we wouldn't be in a world where we are. And there's obviously a lot of good. I'm not too pessimistic about where we are, but at the same time, there are a lot of startups who've cut corners and are constantly screwing their users to shortcut and bypass access to data,
I think
which
that
is not.
Yeah, I think the sweet spot lies in aligning the values of the business and aligning the values of, like, the ethics of or the fairness to the customer. So if the
Mhm.
businesses are kind of saying, "Yeah, but," and I get it, we need to move fast, we need to make money, our investors are on our backs, whatever it is, the pressures that they are facing shouldn't be, I don't mean to dismiss them, and that's not
Mm.
intelligent, that's not realistic, and instead what we can do is just match the two and find a solution where, hey, actually the goal that you have and the seemingly oppositional goal that the customer has to have you be fair so that you don't get a lawsuit, there's a creative way to go through and make sure there's a win-win situation. I think just a little bit of creativity and stepping back and saying, how can our values find a way to align is the key here. This is my approach to everything I've done for the past over a decade, is the anthropological approach. And so it's a values matching thing. And then it's how you do that is like a very elegant strategy to match those values. So we make money and we honor the IP.
You also have a workshop that founders and early stage founding teams can take. Do you want to talk a little about what the workshop entails and how can teams take advantage of that to get a better understanding of what they need to build?
Yeah. So these workshops were really born out of a lot of the questions you and so many founders have around, like, well, I don't have time. Can you do a plug and play solution? How do I even begin to think like this? So the workshop series They're called Think Like an Anthropologist, so that if you start thinking in these ways where you want to observe culture naturally, where you want to observe the habits of your users without tainting anything, then you'll hopefully it'll be like teach a man to fish in some ways. So I have introductory workshops for 1 day, 4 hours. So you get a taste test of the research methods. You can, as I mentioned, examine your assumptions, but we'll do that. I'll walk you through how to do that in a very organized, systematic way, so you don't get you don't get overwhelmed or even upset when you're airing out your assumptions. Cultivating some of the things you mentioned about what are good interview techniques, what are good observational techniques, how do I evaluate digital user experiences and collect that data to really get the best insights in a short amount of time. And then, of course, we'll participate in a group discussion. So you could also see the value in incorporating different interpretations of the data into your final output. So it's very important that you don't do the research and the analysis in isolation. You should have peer reviews essentially. So that's one. And then a 3 day immersion where we actually work on a problem that your company or startup is having. So you essentially bring that to the table. We'll do a little bit of homework so that you could keep working at the problem, and you'll walk away in that 3 day workshop with a research plan that's custom created for the issue that you're facing. And we will have examined the problem so that, like I alluded to before, the problem becomes more clear and you get to know the details of the problem so that you know how to investigate it further, and you can find a more appropriate solution for it once you're done with your research. And in that one, we'll also do some observational field work since we have the gift of time, and you'll bring back your field notes and we'll talk about how to take really good notes so that you capture the most important data. And then I have a apprenticeship, I call it, and that's a 3 week minimum, and that's something where the founders shadow me whenever they can, but I will also pick up the slack and do some more in-depth research so that by the end of that apprenticeship, I will have taught you some skills. You will have observed some things from the way that I work and think as an anthropologist. But will work on the research plan so it's more robust. I'll actively do the research and train the team on some of these research methods, and then we'll walk away from all of this with those actionable insights, at least, like a slice of what we have time for. So I do want that apprenticeship to end in things that you could actually act on, insights, data that will actually help you move forward with your product development and marketing strategy.
So there you have it. If as a founder you're struggling with understanding your customers, the link to Vajanthi's workshops should be in the show notes. Please grab them and book a meeting. Thanks for sharing the details.
I'd like to say one more thing. The approach that we're all taking as anthropologists is not only to understand your customers, but it's understanding yourself in the process. So both of those things will naturally happen at the end of any engagement,
Yeah,
any workshop. So be prepared, but it's also going to be really good for you in the long run.
the founder in me always wants to focus on the customer, but totally. Truth, observing,
Yeah.
you're almost a guru.
Well, I did teach applied anthropology to college students, and it was a lot of wrangling of like, yes, you have to understand yourself in order to really properly understand the audiences that you're observing. So this is tried and true. It's not my invention, but I did teach this for quite a while. So I would love to have founders benefit from that approach as well.
Time
Mhm.
for rapid fire.
Oh my
All right,
goodness.
so the questions are obviously
Okay.
a surprise. We haven't spoken about these. It should be fun, should be simple. So first question: what's the most surprising insight you've gained from observing a customer behavior in the field?
That observing them with their knowledge that they almost perform, and they become like the little kid who wants to please the teacher or the parent. They want to do a good job, and sometimes they even ask, "Was that okay? Did I do it right? Did I answer it right?" So that was
Yeah, I've heard
very
that.
surprising and in ways endearing.
Next question. If you could apply one anthropological technique to solve a common startup problem instantly, what would that be and why?
It would be participant observation. So this is where you walk a mile in the shoes of your customer, use the product, live their lives, participate as closely to their day-to-day activities as you
Hmm.
can. And that is the biggest empathy builder, the biggest insight generator that you could have.
So live in their shoes for whatever time you can.
Yeah, in every sense of the word. And I'll just bring up that we finally convinced in that Mercedes-Benz use case, we had at the end finally convinced the senior leadership to actually sit with the loan processors for half a day and then actually use the software. The leader that was most championing the software nearly threw the computer out the window because he finally understood what they were going through.
Yeah, that's probably the most high impact activity you could do. What's the common myth about customer research that you wish more founders understood?
That it's a nice to have and not a must have. That it's an afterthought and not the foundational activity, that it should be something you do when you get more money and you have more time in the later stage, and not the thing that will be part of the birth of your product.
Yeah, that's what they believe right now, and you think it should be the opposite. Yeah. The fix to that though is probably more founders acting like an anthropologist because they don't have the money, right? So if anthropologists
Yeah,
like you want to make the biggest impact, in the startup world, I think it probably should start with teaching founders to be or act like an anthropologist.
absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks for answering the rapid fire. It was fun talking to you again and recording this. That's it for today. It was great having you.
Yeah, thank you. This was really nice. And I thought the rapid fire would be more, you'd ask me more like scary questions. So it was very chill. Thank you for that.
If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast app is. See you in the next episode.